I thought that Saturday morning was a simple grocery run. At the checkout, the cart overflowed with caviar, truffle butter, and artisanal chocolate I never chose. Humiliating me before the crowd, my husband yelled, "You want my mom to pay for groceries?" What he did not realize was that 4 days ago, I found the secret files proving these delicacies were merely a rehearsal to steal my building. I decided to let them put on their show. My name is Mia Wainwright, and I honestly thought that Saturday morning was going to be nothing more than a simple, mundane errand run to start the weekend. The sun was just starting to cut through the crisp, early morning air, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floors of the apartment I lived in. It was a beautiful, quiet space located on the second floor of Wainwright Row, the 2-story brick building I had purchased entirely on my own, with my own hard-earned savings, well before I ever put on a wedding dress. I relished these quiet weekend mornings. I had my favorite insulated travel mug filled to the brim with dark roast coffee, its warmth seeping comfortingly into my palms. My shopping list was meticulously short and entirely unassuming. I needed a carton of oat milk, a dozen free-range eggs, some chicken breasts for a simple Sunday dinner, and perhaps a fresh loaf of sourdough bread from the bakery section. It was supposed to be a quick, 15-minute trip to Graydon Market with my husband, Nolan Mercer. Then, his mother, Evelyn Mercer, casually emerged from the guest room and announced she was coming along. She adjusted her silk scarf and claimed she only needed to pick up a few small things for the weekend, promising she would not slow us down. I should have known better than to believe her. I should have seen the calculated gleam in her eye. But I was still playing the role of the accommodating wife, even though a cold dread had been sitting in my stomach for exactly 4 days. The moment the heavy automatic glass doors of Graydon Market slid open, welcoming us with a blast of air conditioning and the smell of fresh-cut flowers, the entire dynamic of the morning shifted. The store was already bustling with the eager weekend grocery crowd, a chaotic but familiar symphony of rattling shopping carts, squeaking wheels, and smooth jazz playing softly over the overhead speakers. Evelyn did not hesitate for a single second. She bypassed the vibrant, colorful displays of everyday organic produce, ignoring the apples and the leafy greens entirely. Instead, she took firm, undeniable control of the silver handle of our shopping cart and steered us directly toward the aisles paved with imported rustic tiles and illuminated by soft, expensive ambient lighting. We were entering the high-end gourmet section, a place we rarely visited for weekly necessities. I trailed a few steps behind her, sipping my coffee, watching in a state of growing, silent disbelief as she began tossing items into the wire basket with the practiced, careless ease of someone who was thoroughly enjoying spending someone else's money. It started with a small, innocent-looking glass jar, then another. Soon, the entire bottom of the shopping cart was completely obscured by a curated collection of absolute culinary extravagance. She reached out and grabbed 3 different vacuum-sealed packages of wild-caught Scottish smoked salmon. Next came 2 heavy, ornate glass jars of imported French fig jam, followed closely by a small, impossibly expensive tub of authentic black truffle butter. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers brush past the standard baking aisles, showing zero interest in regular chocolate chips, only to select half a dozen artisanal, gold-wrapped dark chocolate bars imported from Belgium. Then came the real shocker, a sleek, black tin of Russian caviar, which she placed delicately next to a large, artisan-roasted bag of Marcona almonds. She topped off the pile with a slender, elegant bottle of aged balsamic vinegar, the kind that cost more than a full week's worth of standard groceries for 2 people. The cart was getting heavier by the minute, and the tight knot in my stomach was pulling tighter, twisting into a hard ball of resentment. I glanced over at Nolan, fully expecting him to gently intervene. I waited for him to remind his mother that we were here for basic weekend staples, not catering a lavish royal gala. Instead, he was leaning against the end of the aisle, idly scrolling through some sports article on his smartphone, completely unbothered by the mountain of luxury goods piling up right in front of him. He looked up, saw the caviar, and simply went back to his screen. I stepped closer to him, leaning in so the other affluent shoppers browsing the artisanal cheeses would not overhear our domestic dispute. "What is all this for?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly low and perfectly even, though my heart was beginning to race. Nolan snapped his phone shut, his jaw tightening instantly. He shot me a look of pure, unadulterated irritation, acting as if my very reasonable question was a massive, unwarranted inconvenience to his peaceful morning. "It's just some stuff for my mom," he muttered defensively, not meeting my eyes. "Just let her get what she wants. Mia." "Don't make a thing out of it." Evelyn, possessing the supernatural hearing of a hawk whenever a conversation dared to concern her actions, turned around. A saccharine, perfectly practiced smile was plastered across her face. "Oh, don't worry your pretty head about it, Mia darling," she said, her tone dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my teeth ache. "I'm just putting together a little tasting for some acquaintances. Just a small, intimate gathering of friends." I stared at her, refusing to break eye contact. "A tasting where when is this happening? And who exactly is paying for all of this?" Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in her polished veneer, before returning brighter and vastly more brittle than before. Details, my dear. It's all being handled. Let's just get to the register before the lines get too long." She turned her back to me with a dismissive wave of her hand, shutting down the conversation entirely and dropping a wedge of triple cream brie into the cart for good measure. The checkout lanes were packed tightly, a sea of impatient weekend shoppers shifting from foot to foot. We finally made our way into lane number 4. The cashier, a young girl with tired eyes and a green apron, began unloading Evelyn's selections onto the moving black belt. The electronic beep of the barcode scanner sounded like a steady, mocking drumbeat of impending financial doom. Beep, the truffle butter. Beep, the caviar. Beep, the imported French jam. The glowing green digital display on the register climbed higher and higher at a terrifying speed, blowing past $100, surging effortlessly past $200, and racing toward a final number that made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ground together. When the very last gold-wrapped chocolate bar was finally scanned, the cashier looked up, her eyes widening slightly at the total on her screen. "That will be $487.50, she announced clearly. Evelyn stood completely still at the end of the register. Her hands were resting comfortably and motionlessly on the strap of her designer leather handbag. She made absolutely no move to open it, no move to reach for a wallet, no gesture of reaching for a credit card. Nolan looked at me, raising his eyebrows in a silent, heavy, and expectant command. The expectation in the air was clear, suffocating, and utterly audacious. They fully expected me to step forward, pull out my card, and blindly fund this charade. I took a deep, grounding breath. The cold, sharp realization of their audacity settling deep into my bones. I stepped forward, but not to the card reader. I reached out, grabbed a plastic grocery divider from the side track, and placed it down with a firm, decisive thud on the black conveyor belt. I placed it right behind Evelyn's massive mountain of gourmet delicacies, and right in front of my single carton of oat milk and my small bag of apples. "I'll only be paying for these," I told the cashier, pointing a steady finger at my small cluster of basic items. Then, I turned my gaze slowly to Evelyn and Nolan. "You two can sort out the payment for the rest of that." The silence that violently crashed over our little section of the grocery store was deafening. The ambient noise of the market seemed to vanish entirely. Evelyn gasped loudly, pressing a dramatic hand to her chest as if I had just physically struck her across the face. Her eyes widened, instantly filling with the glassy, pitiful sheen of expertly manufactured tears. She looked around at the people standing in line behind us, playing the tragic role of the frail, victimized, and abused retired mother to absolute, Oscar-winning perfection. Nolan's face transformed instantly. The simmering irritation I had seen earlier morphed into raw, unadulterated fury. His skin turned a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson. He stepped aggressively toward me, closing the physical distance between us, completely abandoning any lingering sense of public decorum or shame. "You want my mom to pay for groceries," he yelled, his voice rough and incredibly loud, echoing sharply against the high, exposed ceiling of the market. The words hung heavily in the air, loud, jarring, and designed to humiliate. Heads whipped around in every direction. The woman loading her reusable bags in lane 3 stopped dead in her tracks. The older man holding a plastic basket of vegetables directly behind us took a cautious step backward. Everyone was staring. Dozens of eyes were suddenly locked onto us. In the span of 5 short seconds, Nolan had successfully painted a masterpiece of manipulation, framing me as the undeniable villain of Graydon Market. To these strangers, I was the cruel, heartless, tight-fisted, and ungrateful wife publicly humiliating her sweet, defenseless mother-in-law over a simple grocery bill on a Saturday morning. The crowd looked at me with varying degrees of intense judgment, disgust, and whispered pity for Evelyn. Evelyn let out a small, pathetic, trembling sniffle, clutching her leather purse even tighter against her chest, her shoulders slumping in practiced defeat. Nolan glared at me, his chest heaving with exaggerated indignation, waiting for me to crumble under the crushing weight of public shaming. He was waiting for me to panic, to flush with embarrassment, and to quickly pull out my wallet to pay the $487.50 just to make the horrific scene disappear. But I did not argue. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not desperately try to explain to the sea of judging strangers that the items sitting on that belt were not basic milk and bread to keep an old woman fed, but rather luxury props for a sinister scheme I had already uncovered. I felt the cold, hard, undeniable facts of the secret documents I had found hidden in his office exactly 4 days ago anchoring me firmly to the floor. They thought they were backing me into a corner. They thought public pressure would break me. They had absolutely no idea that they were simply handing me the shovel they would use to dig their own graves. I looked at my husband. I really looked at the man who was currently yelling at me over imported artisanal cheese, and I just smiled. It was a cold, empty, terrifyingly calm smile. This was not the time for me to lose control. This was not the moment for a messy, hysterical, screaming match in a grocery store. This was the precise moment I decided to let them show exactly who they were. I was going to let them scream, let them put on their show, and let them expose their bottomless entitlement for the whole world to see, because soon they would have absolutely nothing left. The drive back from Graydon Market was suffocatingly silent, but my mind was screaming as every buried memory from the past year violently clawed its way to the surface. For months, I had been diligently ignoring a steady, creeping parade of red flags, convincing myself that I was just being overly sensitive about my independence. I lived with Nolan on the expansive second floor of Wainwright Row, a beautiful, historic 2-story brick building that stood as the proudest achievement of my life. I had purchased that property entirely on my own, relying strictly on the funds I had aggressively saved for over 7 years, alongside a commercial mortgage that bore my signature and my name alone. Long before Nolan and I ever exchanged wedding vows, it was my safety net, my sanctuary, and my asset. The ground floor of the building was divided into 2 distinct commercial storefronts. The larger unit was reliably occupied by a charming boutique florist, securing a stable, long-term lease that covered the building's overhead. The second unit, however, was a smaller, uniquely equipped space that had formerly operated as a commercial test kitchen. Currently, I kept it vacant, utilizing it as a personal storage area for old furniture and seasonal decorations, with a concrete plan to renovate it into a dedicated, private workspace and office by the spring of next year. That empty space, however, had slowly become an obsession for my mother-in-law. Starting roughly 8 months ago, Evelyn began to display a sudden, intense, and deeply unnatural interest in the structural details of my property. At first, she would slip her inquiries into casual conversation over Sunday brunches. She would ask, with feigned innocent curiosity, about the exact square footage of the vacant unit. A few weeks later, She casually inquired about the maximum load capacity of the electrical panels. Then came the questions about the width of the rear alleyway exit, and whether the commercial grease traps left over from the previous tenants were still actively permitted by the city health department for food service operations. I initially wrote it off as the eccentric curiosity of a retiree with too much free time, but her focus was relentlessly laser-sharp. Soon after Evelyn started her structural interrogations, Nolan began introducing his own brand of unsettling questions. His inquiries were wrapped in the guise of responsible, mature financial planning, but they always carried a dark, probing undertone. We would be sitting on the sofa on a Tuesday evening, half watching a movie, when he would pause the television and ask me exactly what would happen to the deed of Wainwright Row if I were to suddenly pass away. It was a morbid, jarring question that he tried to play off as standard marital preparedness. A month later, while we were reviewing our annual tax documents, he leaned back in his chair and aggressively pitched the idea of transferring my building into a family limited liability company. He listed off a dozen supposed tax benefits, insisting it was the smartest move to protect our future, carefully ignoring the fact that the asset belonged entirely to me. When I politely but firmly declined, he sulked for 3 days, asking bitterly how the profits would be legally divided if I ever decided to sell the property without his consent. Whenever Nolan failed to persuade me with pseudo-legal jargon, Evelyn would swoop in to apply a heavy layer of moral guilt. She was a master of the passive-aggressive philosophical monologue. She would sip her Chardonnay, look at me with eyes brimming with manufactured disappointment, and deliver her practiced lines. You know, Mia, a true family operates as a single, unified entity, she would say, her voice dripping with condescending wisdom. When major financial assets in a family are hoarded and controlled by just one person, it creates a terribly unhealthy power dynamic. It simply is not sustainable. Wealth is meant to be shared, to build a legacy together, not locked away in a solitary fortress. She always managed to frame my financial independence as a severe moral failing, painting herself as the enlightened advocate for family unity while subtly demanding access to my property. The emotional manipulation eventually escalated into blatant physical trespassing. The vacant commercial space downstairs had a secure keypad lock, but Nolan, as my husband, naturally knew the entry code. I began to find inexplicable, highly curated scenes staged amidst my dusty storage boxes. I went down one afternoon to retrieve my winter coat and found a pristine, white linen tablecloth draped elegantly over a stack of moving crates. A week later, a centerpiece of expensive, exotic floral arrangements appeared on a folding table. By the beginning of last month, several mock-up, luxury food hamper boxes were stacked neatly in the corner, filled with decorative straw and ribbon. Evelyn never once asked for my permission to enter the space, let alone use it as a staging ground. She acted with the breezy, absolute entitlement of a landlord casually inspecting her own dominion. It was as if she genuinely believed the keys had already been handed over, and my name on the deed was merely a temporary clerical error waiting to be corrected. The most alarming incident, the one I had forcefully pushed to the back of my mind, occurred exactly 2 weeks ago. I arrived home from work 3 hours earlier than my usual schedule due to a canceled afternoon meeting. As I walked past the ground floor, I noticed the heavy wooden door to the vacant space was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and found Nolan standing in the center of the room. He was holding his smartphone high in the air, methodically taking dozens of wide-angle photographs of the exposed brick walls, the high ceilings, and the layout of the old plumbing fixtures. He jumped when he heard my footsteps, fumbling with his phone for a split second before recovering his composure. When I demanded to know what he was doing, he offered a painfully smooth, rehearsed smile. "Oh, hey, honey," he had said, casually sliding the phone into his pocket. "I was just taking a few shots to send to my mom. She wanted to see how the afternoon lighting hits the front windows for her little interior design scrapbook." It was a ridiculous, transparent lie, but I chose to swallow it. I chose to bite my tongue and nod because I was so desperately exhausted from the constant, low-grade tension. I chose peace over truth, foolishly convincing myself that Evelyn merely wanted to control my kitchen menus and the centerpieces, not the literal foundation of my livelihood. But standing in that grocery store aisle, watching the total climb past $400 for gourmet delicacies, the fragile dam of my denial finally shattered. Every single bizarre question, every passive-aggressive comment, every staged tablecloth, and every secret photograph crashed together with blinding clarity. The pieces of the puzzle locked into place, forming a picture that made my blood run ice cold. The items Evelyn had piled into that shopping cart, the imported caviar, the gold-wrapped chocolates, the truffle butter, were not the random cravings of a spoiled woman. They were meticulously chosen inventory. They were stage props for a highly specific, pre-planned business venture. The horrifying truth settled heavily onto my chest. This had never been about a casual, impromptu tasting party for a few acquaintances. Evelyn had spent the last 8 months mapping out a comprehensive, hostile takeover of my commercial space. And my own husband had been feeding her the floor plans and the legal loopholes every step of the way. They were not just crossing boundaries, they were actively laying the groundwork to turn my profitable building into her personal stage, reducing me to nothing more than a silent, involuntary financial backer in my own home. It was exactly 4 days before that public spectacle at the grocery store when the entire foundation of my marriage silently crumbled. It happened on a Tuesday evening, a completely ordinary night that smelled of roasted chicken and rain. Nolan was at the gym, or at least he claimed to be, and I was sitting at the heavy oak desk in our shared home office. The water heater servicing the ground floor had been making a concerning metallic rattling noise, and the florist had texted me about the fluctuating temperatures. I needed to find the original installation invoice to check the warranty terms. I opened the bottom drawer of the large printer cabinet, a space usually reserved for bulk office supplies and dusty, archived folders. I pushed aside 3 unopened reams of white printer paper and a tangle of spare Ethernet cables. My fingers brushed against something that did not belong. It was not a manila folder or a plastic binder. It was smooth, cold, and undeniably expensive. I wrapped my hand around it and pulled it into the light of my desk lamp. It was a thick, unmarked, dark brown leather portfolio. It was not hidden with any particular cleverness. There was no locked drawer, no false bottom, no safe. It was simply wedged behind the paper, tucked away with the supreme, arrogant confidence of someone who firmly believed I was far too deeply entrenched in my own routine to ever go snooping. They thought I was compliant. They thought I was blind. I flipped the leather cover open. The very first page was printed on heavy, high-gloss paper, resembling a polished corporate pitch deck rather than a simple family idea. Centered in a bold, elegant serif font were the words Mercer Table Holdings, directly beneath the title. A subtitle detailed the nature of the enterprise, a premier gourmet pantry and private tasting studio, and beneath that, the proposed address was proudly displayed. It was my address. It was the exact street number of Wainwright Row, specifying the vacant ground floor unit. A cold, prickly sensation began to spread from the base of my neck, creeping slowly down my spine. The air in the office suddenly felt incredibly thin. I turned the page. The next section outlined the proposed corporate structure. It featured a neat, professionally designed organizational chart. At the very top, reigning supreme in a solid black box, was Evelyn Mercer, designated as the Chief Executive Director. Directly beneath her, connected by a thick line of authority, was Nolan Mercer, listed as the co-manager of operations. I scanned the rest of the page, looking for my own name. I finally found it, relegated to the very bottom corner in a small, dashed line box that denoted no operational authority whatsoever. My title was not partner. It was not co-founder. It was foundational asset contributor. I was not a person in this grand scheme. I was merely the concrete slab upon which they planned to build their kingdom. I kept reading, the silence of the empty apartment ringing loudly in my ears. I reached the financial projection pages, and the sheer, breathtaking audacity of their plan began to reveal itself in stark black and white numbers. Under a section titled Initial Phase Revenue Stabilization, there was a detailed line item explaining how the business would survive its fragile first 6 months. The document explicitly stated that the incoming rental cash flow from the existing, long-term floral tenant would be diverted to cover the overhead of the tasting studio. They were planning to hijack the income that paid the mortgage of my building to float Evelyn's vanity project. Further down the page, another line item caught my eye, making my stomach violently pitch. It read, "Contingency funding sourced from M's personal reserves. M. Mia. Me." They had already mentally liquidated my private savings accounts to serve as their backup safety net. But the absolute worst was yet to come. The horror shifted from profound disrespect to potential financial ruin when I reached the correspondence appendix at the back of the portfolio. It was a neatly clipped stack of printed email chains. The primary correspondents were Evelyn, Nolan, and a senior commercial loan officer working for Harrogate Commercial Finance. I read the emails line by line, my breathing turning shallow and fast. They were actively, aggressively negotiating the terms for a substantial 6-figure startup loan. To secure a loan of that magnitude with zero business history and terrible personal credit, the bank required collateral. Evelyn and Nolan were offering Wainwright Row. They were offering the building I owned as the absolute guarantee for their debt. My hands started to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that rattled the crisp pages. How could they possibly do this without my consent? How far had they actually gone? I turned to the next section and immediately felt all the blood drain from my face. Staring back at me from the glossy paper were high-resolution scans of my most private, sensitive documents. There was my federal tax return from the previous year. There was the complete, signed commercial lease agreement I held with the florist. There were detailed property income reports that I only kept on my password-protected laptop. There were even copies of my driver's license and the original deed to the building. Then, I saw the signatures. They had gathered several digital copies of my signature, lifted directly from previous repair contracts and old insurance documents. They had isolated the ink, cleaned up the background, and printed them out like a twisted reference sheet. They were studying how I signed my name. I felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me, a physical sickness that made me grip the edge of the heavy oak desk just to stay upright. I was looking at the meticulous, deliberate architecture of financial treason. And then, I found the final piece of the puzzle. It was a small, neon yellow sticky note, pressed casually against a draft of a spouse consent form. The handwriting was messy, slanted sharply to the left, and unmistakably belonged to my husband. I had seen that exact handwriting on 100 grocery lists and anniversary cards. The note read, "Put the signature page behind the insurance renewal packet. She usually flips through fast." I sat there in the heavy silence, staring at that yellow square of paper for what felt like hours. That single, hastily scribbled sentence fundamentally altered the entire landscape of my reality. The man I slept next to every single night, the man I shared my life and my dreams with, had sat at this very desk and strategized the most efficient way to trick me into signing away my life's work. He knew exactly how much I trusted him when he handed me routine household paperwork to sign. He was actively weaponizing my own absolute trust against me. From that exact second onward, everything changed. I understood with terrifying clarity that this was no longer a simple, mundane domestic dispute about an overbearing mother-in-law pushing her boundaries. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a highly structured, legally perilous, thoroughly calculated ambush. There was a clear roadmap, a defined timeline, and my husband had a very specific, assigned role to blindside me, to manipulate me, and to force my hand onto a dotted line I would never willingly touch. I did not storm out of the office. I did not march down the stairs, wake the entire building, and hurl that heavy leather portfolio at my husband. Instead, my hands moved with an eerie, mechanical precision that I did not know I possessed. I carefully slid the draft spouse consent form back behind the insurance renewal packet, placing it precisely where his messy handwritten note instructed. I closed the dark cover, tucked the portfolio firmly behind the 3 reams of printer paper, and slid the drawer shut until it clicked. I stood in the middle of the room and took a deep, steadying breath, letting the icy air of absolute betrayal settle permanently in my lungs. Then, I turned off the desk lamp and walked downstairs. Nolan was sitting comfortably on our living room sofa, freshly showered from the gym, casually watching a late evening sports recap. He did not look like a mastermind of financial ruin. He looked exactly like the same man I had married, mindlessly munching on a handful of salted pretzels. I walked over, sat down next to him, curled my legs beneath me, and asked him how his workout was. My voice did not shake even a fraction. My pulse remained completely steady. I smiled at a joke he made about his trainer. I played the role of the oblivious, trusting wife so flawlessly it terrified me. I realized in that exact moment that if the man I loved could lie to me through deliberate omission, I could absolutely lie to him through my physical presence. The very next morning, the exact second Nolan walked out the front door for work, I picked up my phone and dialed the direct private line for Adrian Vale. Adrian was the razor-sharp, aggressively competent real estate attorney who had meticulously structured the legal and corporate framework for Wainwright Row years ago when I first purchased the building. She answered on the second ring. I did not waste any of her billable time with pleasantries or tearful breakdowns. I laid out every single detail of what I had found in that bottom drawer, describing the business plan, the loan applications, the forged signature attempts, and the sticky note. Adrian listened in total, unbroken silence. When I finally finished speaking, her voice came through the speaker, crisp, professional, and entirely unbothered by the emotional weight of my marital collapse. Legally speaking, Mia, they are standing on incredibly dangerous quicksand, Adrian stated firmly. You hold the entire property under a single-member limited liability company. You are the sole managing member. Nolan has absolutely zero equity in that building, and Evelyn has even less than zero. They cannot legally leverage that commercial property for a business loan without your explicit, notarized, and legally verifiable consent. A small, desperate wave of relief tried to wash over me, but Adrienne quickly and ruthlessly cut it off. However, she continued, her tone shifting to a stark, urgent warning. Do not for 1 second underestimate the sheer, catastrophic chaos they can cause if you simply sit on your hands and wait. If they manage to cobble together a convincing package of fraudulent family consent documents, mix in your real tax returns, and present a unified, confident front to a hungry loan officer trying to meet a quota, they could tangle your property in a massive administrative nightmare. We are talking about severely clouded titles, immediate and severe personal credit damage, and a toxic legal mess that could easily spook your long-term floral tenant right out of their lease. A bank compliance department might eventually figure out the fraud, but the interim damage to your financial standing and your professional reputation would take years of expensive litigation to untangle. I spent the next 4 solid hours executing a silent, comprehensive digital lockdown of my entire existence. I photographed every single page of the leather portfolio with my smartphone, uploading the high-resolution images to a secure, encrypted cloud server that Nolan did not even know existed. Then, I systematically changed my passwords. I changed the complex access codes for my primary and secondary email accounts. I locked down my federal and state tax portals with 2-factor authentication linked only to my private device. I reset the administrative logins for my secure document storage, my personal banking applications, and every single property management portal associated with the maintenance of Wainwright Row. I built an invisible, impenetrable fortress around my life and my assets while my husband sat in his corporate office across town, completely unaware that his stolen digital keys no longer worked. Later that afternoon, strictly following a very specific and aggressive strategy Adrienne had drafted for me, I made a phone call to the Corporate Compliance and Fraud Department of Harrogate Commercial Finance. I bypassed the eager, Frontline loan officers completely and spoke directly to a senior risk manager. I politely but firmly informed them that my legal name and my commercial property were currently being referenced in a pending startup loan application under the corporate entity name Mercer Table Holdings. I formally instructed them and followed up with a certified legal email from Adrienne that absolutely no collateral agreements, spouse consent forms, or financial guarantees utilizing my personal or business assets were to be considered valid or binding unless I verified them in person, with my attorney present in the room. "Do you want us to immediately flag the file and cancel their upcoming appointment?" the risk manager asked, clearly alarmed by the severe legal implications of my call. "No," I replied, my voice perfectly smooth and completely devoid of any hesitation. "Do not cancel the appointment. I want you to let the application process continue exactly as they scheduled it. Just make sure those hard compliance flags are buried deep in their file, ready for the final executive review." By late Thursday afternoon, Adrienne called me back with the final, ugly truth that tied the entire nightmare together. She had run a comprehensive, deep dive background and financial credit check on Evelyn. The grand poetic narrative of building a beautiful family legacy for the community was a complete and utter fabrication. Evelyn was financially drowning. She ran a boutique gourmet gift box service about 5 years ago, Adrienne explained, the sharp rustle of printed reports echoing over the line. It failed miserably within 18 months. She is still carrying a massive amount of high-interest personal debt from that failed venture. Furthermore, she has a quiet but legally active judgment against her from a specialty packaging vendor that she simply never paid. She has hidden this severe financial distress from her entire family. Her credit profile is completely toxic. Mia. No reputable bank would lend her a dime on her own signature. I sat alone in my quiet kitchen, watching the late afternoon sunlight reflect off the polished granite countertops, and I finally understood the complete, terrifying architecture of their desperation. Evelyn did not just want to steal my vacant ground floor space to host fancy tasting parties and play the role of a local socialite. She desperately needed a clean, unencumbered, high-value asset. She needed a property fully owned by someone else, a property with a proven, stable commercial cash flow from an existing tenant, to serve as the life raft for her rapidly sinking financial ship. She was actively plotting to use my hard-earned life savings to unconditionally bail out her past failures. And the man I married was holding the door open for her to do it. I could have confronted them that very night. I could have printed out the Harrogate emails, thrown them onto the dining room table, locked Evelyn out of the building forever, and demanded a divorce right then and there. But simply stopping them felt incredibly inadequate. It felt like a hollow victory. If I just blocked the loan and screamed at them, Evelyn would instantly play the victim. She would cry and claim I misunderstood her intentions. Nolan would defensively claim he was just exploring creative financial options for our future and that I was overreacting to a harmless draft. They would retreat, regroup, and seamlessly twist the narrative to make me look like the paranoid, unsupportive, and cruel wife. I decided right then and there that I was not going to merely shut the door on their grand plan. I was going to hold the heavy door wide open, smile gracefully, and let them walk all the way inside the trap. I wanted them to get so incredibly comfortable, so blindly arrogant, and so deeply, emotionally invested in their stolen kingdom that they would willingly expose every single shred of their true, entitled nature. I would patiently wait for the absolute perfect moment. I would wait until they stepped up to the podium, ready to claim their unearned victory and take a bow, before I violently pulled the floorboards out from under their feet. The ride back to Wainwright Row was a masterclass in suffocating, unspoken hostility. The moment I unlocked the heavy oak door to our second-floor apartment, the tension in the air crystallized into a thick, almost breathable silence. We stepped into the kitchen, the sunlight streaming across the polished granite island, highlighting the stark contrast between the bright morning and the dark storm brewing inside. Nolan immediately walked to the stainless steel refrigerator, opening the heavy double doors and staring blankly at the shelves. A classic avoidance tactic masquerading as sudden hunger. Evelyn, maintaining her flawless performance of the wounded matriarch, lowered herself gently onto one of the leather bar stools. She kept her designer handbag clutched tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed firmly on the hardwood floor, radiating a practiced, quiet victimhood. Nolan shut the refrigerator door with a soft thud and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. He took a deep breath, slipping effortlessly into his familiar, condescending role of the family peacemaker. "Look, Mia," he began, his voice dropping into that soothing, placating register that used to calm me down but now made my skin crawl. My mother was just getting carried away. She was excited about the food. You did not have to completely humiliate her in front of half the neighborhood. It was incredibly cruel, and frankly, completely uncalled for. I did not set down my purse. I walked directly to the center of the kitchen island, pulling the small, crumpled paper receipt for my carton of oat milk and my single bag of apples from my pocket. I placed it flat on the cold granite surface, smoothing out the edges with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Then, I looked up and met his gaze, my own eyes completely devoid of the warmth he was used to. "The humiliation has not even started yet," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, deadpan whisper that instantly froze the room. I saw the file. Nolan blinked, a split second of genuine confusion flashing across his features before the horrific realization hit him like a physical blow. I did not give him a chance to recover or formulate a lie. I fired the details at them with the precision of a prosecuting attorney. "I know exactly what Mercer Table Holdings is. I know about the proposed gourmet pantry and private tasting studio you plan to build downstairs. I know about the pending commercial loan application currently sitting on a desk at Harrogate Commercial Finance. And most importantly, I know about the neon yellow sticky note instructing someone to hide the spouse consent signature page behind the insurance renewal packet because, quote, she usually flips through fast." The color violently drained from Nolan's face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. His jaw actually dropped open, but no sound came out. He looked desperately at his mother for a lifeline. Evelyn's reaction, however, was the most damning evidence of all. She did not gasp. She did not ask me what file I was talking about. She did not feign ignorance. Her spine snapped perfectly straight, the act of the fragile, bullied elderly woman vanishing in a millisecond. Her eyes narrowed, cold and calculating. "You are blowing this entirely out of proportion, Mia," Evelyn said smoothly, instantly shifting her tactical approach. She abandoned the tears and adopted the tone of a seasoned corporate executive handling a minor human resources dispute. "We were merely exploring viable opportunities for the future of this family. We were putting together a preliminary concept. That space downstairs is sitting there, utterly wasted, gathering dust. It is a sin to let family assets stagnate when they could be generating a legacy. Do not dare use the word family to justify theft," I snapped back, my voice slicing through her polished corporate jargon. "Let us strip away the flowery language. Evelyn, your preliminary concept involves using a building you do not own to secure a massive loan you cannot afford. It involves hijacking the rental income from my florist to subsidize your vanity project, and it relies entirely on my supposed stupidity and my trusting nature to sign away my financial security to bail you out of the debt from your last failed business venture." Evelyn's mouth tightened into a thin, white line, but I was done with her. I turned my full, blistering attention back to my husband, who was now gripping the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles were bone white. "Nolan," I said, my tone demanding absolute, immediate compliance. "Explain to me right now why my personal federal tax returns and the executed commercial lease agreement for my tenant were sitting inside that leather portfolio. How did Harrogate get those documents?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, anywhere but at my face. "I sent them to her," he whispered, his voice cracking pitifully. "Speak up," I commanded. I sent the documents to my mom, he repeated, slightly louder but still dripping with cowardice. She needed them to see if the numbers would even work for the underwriter. I just wanted to get the preliminary paperwork out of the way to prepare in advance, to avoid bothering you with all the boring administrative details until we knew if the bank would even approve the concept. I was trying to save you the stress. That single, pathetic excuse was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. In that exact moment, I realized Nolan was not just a weak man caught between a demanding mother and a wife. He was an active, willing participant in my financial sabotage. He had consciously, deliberately crossed a massive boundary, stealing my highly sensitive financial data. And then he had constructed a fragile psychological lie to convince himself that he was actually doing me a favor. He had redefined betrayal as proactive marital management. You were trying to save me the stress of knowing you were leveraging my life savings, I summarized, the bitter irony heavy on my tongue. How incredibly thoughtful of you. I turned back to Evelyn. The time for polite, strained family dynamics was permanently over. Evelyn, you are going to stand up right now, I told her, pointing a steady finger toward the front door. You are going to walk out of this apartment, and you are going to go back to your own home. As of this exact second, you are strictly forbidden from entering this apartment ever again. Furthermore, you are formally banned from stepping foot inside the vacant commercial space downstairs. If I see you on the ground floor of my building, or if I find out you have accessed that space without my explicit, written, and notarized permission, I will immediately call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. Do you understand me? Evelyn stood up slowly, her face a mask of furious, restrained indignation. She opened her mouth to argue, to deploy another layer of guilt, but she saw the absolute, immovable deadness in my eyes and thought better of it. She adjusted her silk scarf with shaking hands, grabbed her designer bag, and marched out of the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind her, rattling the picture frames on the wall. The silence returned, but this time it belonged entirely to me. I looked at Nolan. He looked utterly broken, a pathetic shell of the confident man who had yelled at me in the grocery store less than an hour ago. Are you kicking me out too? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, thick with sudden, desperate panic. I stared at him, analyzing the man I had promised to spend my life with. I could have thrown his clothes onto the street right then. I could have changed the locks in an hour. But I needed to know the complete depth of the rot. I needed to see exactly how far down the rabbit hole he had willingly crawled before I finalized my next move. No, I replied coldly, crossing my arms. You are not leaving yet, but you are on a very tight clock. You have exactly 24 hours to sit down at this table and tell me every single thing you have done. I want to know every phone call, every email, every forged document, and every lie you have told me over the last 8 months. I want the entire, unvarnished truth, because if I find out even one more detail on my own, or if my attorney uncovers a single unauthorized signature that you try to hide from me today, I will not just divorce you. I will make sure the fraud department at Harrogate has everything they need to pursue criminal charges against you both. I did not wait for his answer. I turned my back on him, picked up my travel coffee mug, and walked down the hallway to the master bedroom, locking the door firmly behind me. The battle lines were officially drawn, and I was holding all the ammunition. Evelyn did not retreat to lick her wounds and reflect on her monumental overstep. The very second she was ushered out of my apartment, she did not experience a single shred of genuine remorse. Instead, she immediately escalated the situation, treating her exile not as a boundary being enforced, but as a vicious, unprovoked attack on her maternal dignity. Within 15 minutes of her departure, Nolan's smartphone began to buzz relentlessly on the kitchen counter. It vibrated against the granite, a continuous, angry metallic hum that filled the tense air of the apartment. I watched Nolan from the doorway of our bedroom. He stared at the glowing screen, his shoulders tight, before finally snatching the device and pressing it to his ear. Even from 10 feet away, I could hear the sharp, theatrical pitch of Evelyn's voice. She was sobbing, a wet, gasping sound designed to trigger every protective instinct her son possessed. She wailed about how she had been brutally insulted, how she had been aggressively chased out of her own son's home like a common criminal, and how her fragile heart could not bear the cruelty of my words. Nolan began pacing the length of the hallway, running a stressed hand through his hair. He spoke in hushed, urgent tones, desperately trying to soothe her. "I know. Mom, I am so sorry. Just try to breathe. We will figure this out. I promise. I will talk to her." Watching him grovel to the woman who had just tried to steal my commercial property was a deeply clarifying experience. It laid bare the fundamental, rotting dynamic of our entire relationship. Nolan was a man who had been thoroughly conditioned to view his mother's emotional discomfort as an absolute, five-alarm emergency that required instant resolution. My pain, my boundaries, and my financial security, on the other hand, were mere inconveniences. They were secondary issues that could easily be delayed, debated, or dismissed altogether if they got in the way of keeping Evelyn happy. The next morning, while Nolan was in the shower, the true scale of Evelyn's audacity revealed itself. I was logged into the Central Property Management portal for Wainwright Row, checking the spam folder of the building's generic contact email, a habit I had developed to catch misdirected vendor invoices. Sitting right there at the top of the list was a forwarded message. An interior designer who occasionally worked with my floral tenant had received an invitation, assuming it was an official building event, forwarded it to my administrative address to ask about parking. I clicked on the email, and my blood turned to ice. It was an elegant, digitally embossed invitation addressed to a highly exclusive mailing list of wealthy socialites and bored philanthropists residing in Bell Meadow, the most affluent neighborhood in our district. The invitation cordially requested their presence for an exclusive, private tasting event scheduled for this coming Friday evening. The location was explicitly listed as the vacant ground floor unit of Wainwright Row. The wording of Evelyn's message was a masterpiece of soft manipulation and assumed ownership. She did not mention a lease. She did not mention me, she wrote, in flowing, arrogant prose. Please join us at our new family location to celebrate the culinary arts. Step inside our launch room and be the first to experience the very first step of our legacy brand, Mercer Table. She had already invited the entire local upper crust to my property. Suddenly, the chaotic scene at Graydon Market snapped into a terrifyingly clear focus. The wild-caught smoked salmon, the imported fig jam, the absurdly expensive caviar, and the gold-wrapped chocolates were never intended for a casual Sunday brunch. Those luxury groceries were the raw ingredients and the stage props for this massive social performance. Evelyn and Nolan had waltzed into that supermarket fully intending to use my personal credit card to fund the catering for a launch party on my own property. A party designed to launch a business that was actively trying to steal my building. They viewed my wallet and my real estate as a communal trough, free for them to use whenever they pleased. When Nolan stepped out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding the printed email. I held it up. I did not yell. I did not even raise my voice above a conversational murmur. "Tell me about Friday night," I demanded. He froze, a bead of water dripping slowly down his chest. He looked at the paper, swallowed hard, and instantly dropped his gaze to the floor. "It was just supposed to be a soft launch," he mumbled, his voice completely lacking conviction. "My mom has these connections in Bell Meadow. She thought if we could just get them in the room, if we could show them the vision, we could secure some private micro-investors. And I genuinely hoped that if you saw the event happening, if you saw how beautiful the space looked and how much potential the project truly had, you would soften up. I thought you would realize it was a good idea and want to be part of it." He actually believed that ambushing me with a room full of rich strangers eating cheese off my property would magically erase the fact that he was helping his mother forge my signature on commercial loan documents. I stood up, walked past him without saying another word, and headed straight downstairs to the ground floor. I stood in front of the heavy wooden door of the vacant unit and punched my standard 6-digit security code into the electronic keypad. A harsh, red light flashed, accompanied by a sharp beep indicating an incorrect entry. I tried it again. Red light. Beep. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deep breath to steady the blinding rage bubbling in my chest. Nolan had changed the lock. He had taken the administrative override code and changed the access numbers to something only he and his mother knew. They had physically locked me out of my own square footage to prepare for a party I had never authorized. I marched straight back upstairs, grabbed my phone, and called Adrienne Vale. I relayed the details of the Bell Meadow email, the Friday night tasting event, and the changed keypad code. I expected her to tell me to call a locksmith, change the code back, and hire a security guard for Friday night to turn Evelyn's wealthy friends away at the door. Adrienne, however, had a much colder, vastly more strategic approach. "Do not stop the tasting, Mia," Adrienne instructed, her tone sharp and intensely focused. "Do not change the lock today. Do not send a cancellation email. You need to let them have this party." "Are you insane?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "She is using my building to secure investors for a fraudulent company." "Exactly," Adrienne replied smoothly. "And right now, they are doing it quietly. If you blow this up today, Evelyn will tell everyone in Bell Meadow that you are a hysterical, jealous daughter-in-law who ruined a simple family gathering out of spite. She will spin the narrative, and she will hide the evidence. But if you let her host this event, she will be publicly, loudly, and undeniably claiming ownership of a commercial space she has absolutely zero legal right to occupy. The more confident she feels, the more she will talk. She will create a mountain of undeniable witnesses. We need her to establish a documented pattern of intentionally misrepresenting ownership and usage rights. Let her weave the rope, Mia. Just hand her more length." I hung up the phone and walked back into the living room. Nolan was sitting on the edge of the sofa, fully dressed now, looking like a man waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. He was waiting for me to scream, to demand he cancel the party, to threaten him with divorce papers right then and there. I looked at him, remembering Adrienne's advice. I let my shoulders drop slightly. I allowed a look of profound, exhausted resignation to wash over my face. I sighed, a long, tired sound that seemed to drain the remaining tension from the room. "I am not going to fight you about Friday," I said softly, lying with a fluidity that frankly scared me. "I am too tired. Nolan, if this tasting is so incredibly important to your mother, and if you truly believe this is what you need to do, then fine. Have the event." Relief washed over his face so fast it was almost comical. He stood up, taking a hesitant step toward me, a hopeful, sickeningly sweet smile forming on his lips. "Really? You mean it, Mia. Thank you. I promise, once you see what she has planned, you will understand." "We will see," I replied, turning away to hide the absolute 0-degree chill in my eyes. I chose not to explode. I chose not to make a scene. I was going to silently, dutifully let Evelyn Mercer believe she had successfully manipulated me. I was going to let her think she still had a chance to convince me. All while I calmly prepared to let the entire social network she was trying to weaponize against me become the very audience for her spectacular, undeniable ruin. For the next 2 days, I orchestrated a masterclass in psychological warfare by doing absolutely nothing at all. I transformed my entire demeanor, shedding the cold, terrifying anger of the weekend and adopting a quiet, thoughtful calmness. I did not bring up the leather portfolio. I did not mention the forged signature, the bank loan, or the appalling scene at the grocery store. I simply glided through the apartment like a woman who had vented her frustrations and was now slowly, reasonably coming to terms with reality. Nolan, desperate for any sign that his comfortable life was not disintegrating, swallowed the bait whole. He visibly relaxed, his shoulders dropping from their defensive hunch. He honestly believed I just needed a little bit of time to cool off and process his mother's grand vision. By Wednesday evening, I decided it was time to test the waters. We were sitting at the kitchen island, eating a quiet dinner. I took a sip of water, leaned forward slightly, and asked a carefully calculated question. "So," I began, keeping my tone mild and purely curious, "if this tasting on Friday is actually happening, what exactly is the menu? And who are these people from Bell Meadow? Have you mapped out the renovation costs for the plumbing downstairs?" Nolan looked up from his plate, his eyes widening in pleasant surprise. He practically vibrated with relief. He immediately pulled out his phone, eager to share the details. But Evelyn, who had conveniently stopped by to drop off some linen napkins, eagerly intercepted the conversation. She took my questions not as a trap, but as a complete surrender. In her mind, my practical inquiries meant I had finally capitulated and was now evaluating the business model. Emboldened by my apparent submission, Evelyn could not help herself. She started bragging. She leaned against the granite counter and began to paint a picture of Mercer table that went far beyond a simple gourmet pantry. "Oh, Mia, it is going to be magnificent," she gushed, her hands painting grand gestures in the air. "The tasting room is merely the anchor. We are launching a premium subscription hamper service. Imagine curated boxes of imported cheeses, artisanal crackers, and rare wines delivered monthly to the most exclusive zip codes in the state. We will host private, high-ticket tasting events for corporate executives. By the winter holidays, our corporate gift box division will be fully operational." She paused, taking a dramatic breath, her eyes gleaming with unchecked greed. "And that is just phase one. Once the brand is truly established, we will naturally need to expand our footprint. That little flower shop next door is lovely, of course, but their lease is up in 18 months. We can simply choose not to renew it. We will knock down the adjoining wall, expand the dining area, and maybe even add a small, temperature-controlled wine cellar." I sat perfectly still, my face a carefully constructed mask of polite interest, while my heart pounded a furious, deafening rhythm in my chest. She was not just planning to steal my vacant storage room. She was actively plotting to evict my reliable, long-term tenant, the very florist whose rent paid the mortgage on the entire building. Evelyn was mentally demolishing walls and expanding her empire across my entire property, assuming absolute dominion over every single brick I owned. I nodded slowly, forcing a small, thoughtful smile. "That is certainly a very ambitious long-term plan," I murmured. I turned my attention to my husband, who was beaming with pride at his mother's aggressive business strategy. "Nolan, if I am going to truly understand the scope of all this, I need to see the numbers. Send me the final projected budget and the financial breakdown. I want to read it over so I can be entirely fair about this." Nolan practically tripped over himself to comply. "Absolutely. I will email you the entire spreadsheet bundle right now. You will see." Mia, the profit margins on the corporate gifting alone are staggering. Within 5 minutes, my phone chimed with a new email. By asking him nicely, I had smoothly bypassed the need to dig through his physical files again. He had just voluntarily handed me the final, updated digital copies of their financial projections, complete with time-stamped emails, vendor lists, and a strict operational timeline. Later that night, while Nolan was asleep, I sat in the dark glow of my laptop screen and opened the spreadsheets. I scrolled past the inflated revenue projections and the absurdly high marketing budgets until I hit the loan amortization tab. There, buried in a small column next to the initial capital requirements, was a phrase that made my blood run cold. It read, "Personal guarantee pending from spouse." They had not merely submitted my tax returns and forged my signature on a draft. Someone, either Nolan or Evelyn, had explicitly assured the loan officer at Harrogate that I was fully on board and that my personal, legally binding guarantee of the debt was just days away from being signed. They were actively promising the bank my financial execution. First thing Thursday morning, I forwarded the entire spreadsheet bundle to Adrienne Vale. She did not waste a single second. Her office immediately began drafting a stack of lethal legal documents. She prepared a formal notice of immediate revocation of any and all implied rights to use the ground floor space. She drafted a severe warning regarding the intentional misrepresentation of property ownership. Most importantly, she began organizing the exact paperwork needed to physically serve them when the hammer finally fell. While Adrian handled the legal artillery, I made a quiet phone call of my own. I reached out to an independent commercial building and health inspector I had used years ago when I first bought Wainwright Row. I paid him his emergency consulting fee to do a rapid, discreet pull of the city zoning and health department records for my specific address. He called me back 3 hours later with the exact ammunition I needed. "Mia," the inspector said over the phone, "that vacant unit is currently zoned strictly for dry storage and light retail. The old commercial kitchen permits from the previous tenant expired over 3 years ago. The grease traps have not been certified. The ventilation hood is legally decommissioned, and there is no active health department clearance for food preparation or public consumption of unsealed goods." A cold, triumphant smile spread across my face. Evelyn was not just throwing a presumptuous party. By serving imported cheeses, sliced meats, and open food products to a room full of guests, she was actively violating local health codes. The tasting event itself was crossing a hard legal line. I spent the rest of Thursday moving through my own home like a ghost. I watched Nolan iron his favorite shirt for the big event. I listened to Evelyn excitedly coordinate floral deliveries over the phone, ironically ordering them from a vendor across town instead of the florist she planned to evict. Every word they spoke, every excited plan they made using the equity I had bled for, solidified the iron wall inside my chest. I no longer felt the desperate, agonizing sting of a failing marriage. The desire to scream, to cry, or to shake my husband until he woke up from his mother's spell was completely gone. I realized that giving them the benefit of the doubt was a luxury I could no longer afford. I could not save this marriage by trusting a man who saw my life's work as his mother's playground. I could only save myself by looking at them with perfect, unforgiving clarity. I had supplied them with the perfect bait, and now they had enthusiastically locked themselves inside the cage. All that was left was to throw away the key. The sun had just dipped below the city skyline on Thursday evening, casting long dark shadows across the hardwood floors of my apartment, when my phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. It was not a text message from a friend or a reminder for an upcoming appointment. It was an automated, system-generated notification from the secure digital portal of Harrogate Commercial Finance. When Nolan had initially rushed to set up the online application profile months ago, he must have carelessly allowed my secondary, junk email address to autofill into a secondary contact field. Now, the bank's automated server was blindly doing its job, sending a status update to every address on file. I tapped the screen and opened the message. There was a secure link prompting me to view a recent upload. I logged in, bypassing their weak security questions, and navigated to the document repository. Right there, sitting at the top of the queue, was a file labeled as a spouse consent form. The status tag next to the file name glowed bright green, proudly declaring the document draft completed. I clicked the file and scrolled directly to the bottom of the second page. Staring back at me from the bright glare of my smartphone screen was my own signature. But it was not fresh ink. It was a digitized, poorly cropped image of my signature, blatantly lifted and spliced from a 5-year-old insurance liability waiver I had signed when the roof was repaired. The edges of the digital image were slightly pixelated, a clumsy copy-and-paste job against the crisp white background of the bank form. It was not a flawless, legally binding forgery yet, but the sheer brazen intent was undeniable. They had digitally manipulated my signature and officially uploaded it to a federal commercial lending portal to keep the loan process moving forward. They were actively crossing the line from family manipulation into documented identity theft. I did not gasp. I did not cry. I immediately took 3 clear screenshots of the portal and forwarded them directly to Adrienne Vale. She called me back within 2 minutes, her voice completely devoid of any conversational warmth. She was entirely in her element now, a ruthless legal predator locking onto her target. Mia, Adrian stated flatly, the sound of her rapid typing echoing through the phone speaker. This drastically alters the entire landscape of our strategy. This is no longer merely a toxic family dispute or a civil disagreement over commercial property usage. By actively uploading a manipulated signature to a commercial lender to secure financial backing, they have officially crossed the boundary into severe legal jeopardy. We are now looking at documented attempts at bank fraud. This changes everything. We have them completely boxed in. I ended the call and walked slowly downstairs to the ground floor, needing to feel the solid brick walls of my building around me. Just as I reached the bottom landing, a heavy rhythmic knock echoed from the reinforced steel door that faced the rear alleyway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. A young man wearing a heavy canvas jacket was standing on the concrete step, balancing a large, insulated wax box against his hip. "Evening," he announced casually, pulling a crumpled manifest from his pocket. "I have a special delivery for Mercer Table. I'm looking for the owner lady, Evelyn. She told my dispatcher to drop this final round of imported cheddar at the back door so it would be ready for Friday." He paused, shifting the heavy box again, and looked at me expectantly. "Also, my boss wanted me to ask her when she is going to pay the remaining balance on the deposit for the opening month. She promised she would wire the funds by Tuesday morning, but our accounting department has not seen a single dime." I stared at the delivery driver, the cold night air biting at my cheeks. Evelyn was not just playing pretend in the privacy of my living room. She was actively parading around the local commercial district, aggressively presenting herself to established vendors and regional suppliers as the sole, legitimate owner of my property. She was racking up commercial debt under the fabricated authority of being my landlord. I politely informed the young man that Evelyn was not available, firmly refused the delivery, and shut the heavy steel door, needing a moment to process the sheer audacity of her lies. I walked out to the front sidewalk. The owner of the small boutique bookstore 2 doors down was in the process of locking up his shop for the night. He saw me standing under the street lamp, hesitated for a long moment, and then walked over. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "Mia," he began quietly, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if Evelyn might suddenly appear from the shadows. "I really did not want to get involved in your personal business, but I feel like you need to know what is happening in the neighborhood. Your mother-in-law came into my shop yesterday afternoon to look at some decorative coffee table books for her new space. She was talking incredibly loudly on her mobile phone. I could not help but overhear her." He swallowed hard, looking at me with profound pity. "She told whoever was on the other end of the line that you had finally surrendered. Her exact words were that Mia finally understands that family assets must return to the right hands of the family." I thanked him for his honesty, my voice eerily calm, and walked straight back upstairs to my apartment. Nolan was in the kitchen, casually pouring himself a glass of iced water from the refrigerator dispenser. He looked up and smiled, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world was about to violently collapse. I walked right up to the kitchen island, stopping just 2 feet away from him. "You uploaded a forged spouse consent form to the Harrogate portal this evening," I stated. It was a cold, hard fact, delivered without a single trace of emotion. He froze completely. The glass slipped from his suddenly numb fingers and shattered violently against the hardwood floor, ice and water exploding across our feet. He looked panicked, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a cornered animal searching for an exit. "Mia, please, listen to me," he begged, his hands hovering defensively in the air. "It was just a temporary placeholder. The banking portal absolutely would not let us advance to the final executive review stage without a document uploaded in that specific required field. We were never going to finalize the loan with that draft. We were not going to submit it for final approval without telling you. I swear on my life, you were going to commit federal bank fraud as a temporary administrative placeholder," I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously soft whisper. "Do not lie to me again, Nolan. Tell me the actual plan. Right now." The remaining color drained from his face. He cracked under the weight of his own profound cowardice. He ran his shaking hands over his face and let out a ragged, pathetic breath. "I thought if we could just get the commercial loan approved first," he confessed, staring blankly at the broken glass on the floor, absolutely refusing to meet my eyes. "I thought if we secured the money, set up the entire ground floor, brought the expensive inventory in, and showed you the final, beautiful result, you would change your mind. I genuinely thought you would realize it was a brilliant opportunity. I thought we could just convince you to sign the real, official paperwork later, because when everything takes shape, you will see this is the best choice." That exact sentence was the final, fatal blow. It violently assassinated every single ounce of lingering grace, every drop of mercy, and every shred of marital loyalty I had left in my body. My husband never had any intention of asking for my permission. He never intended to respect my boundaries or my financial independence. He had meticulously plotted, alongside his greedy mother, to force my hand through a coordinated ambush. He fully intended to build his mother's shiny new kingdom on the back of my hard-earned equity, wait until the concrete was poured and the guests arrived, and then demand that I smile, applaud, and pay for the privilege of being robbed. I looked down at the broken glass and the puddle of water seeping into the floorboards. I did not offer to help him clean it up. I turned my back on him and walked slowly down the hallway to my bedroom. I no longer had any desire to fix a misunderstanding. I was completely done trying to save my husband from his mother's toxic influence. My absolute, singular objective from this second forward was to let them confidently step right exactly where they wanted to be on their stolen stage, bathed in the bright, luxurious lights of Bell Meadow's elite, so the entire world could watch when they fell. Friday evening arrived, bringing with it a crisp chill that settled over the city, but the ground floor of my building was radiating an artificial, intoxicating warmth. I waited exactly 45 minutes after the printed start time before I finally walked downstairs. I wanted the room to be full. I wanted the conversations to be flowing, the wine to be poured, and the false sense of security to be complete total. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, and for a fraction of a second, I genuinely did not recognize my own property. Evelyn had transformed the dusty, vacant commercial storage unit into a polished, breathtakingly arrogant illusion of immense wealth. Crisp, white linen tablecloths draped elegantly over rented high-top tables, hiding the scuffed concrete floor beneath. The warm, flickering glow of dozens of tall, unscented pillar candles cast a soft, forgiving light against the exposed brick walls, masking the outdated electrical panels and the decommissioned ventilation hoods. And there, arranged with agonizing, deliberate precision on massive slate serving boards, were the exact gourmet delicacies I had adamantly refused to purchase at Graydon Market. The imported French fig jam glistened in crystal dishes next to generous wedges of triple cream brie. The wild-caught smoked salmon was fanned out perfectly beside the dark, expensive tins of caviar. Slices of Iberian cured meats and the gold-wrapped artisanal chocolates were stacked neatly on tiered silver trays, completely unchecked by any health department regulations. The room was buzzing with the low, sophisticated murmur of Bell Meadow's elite. I counted roughly 25 guests. There were a few wealthy acquaintances, dressed in understated designer cashmere, clutching fragile wine glasses. I immediately spotted two older men in sharp sport coats who carried themselves with the distinct, assessing posture of potential micro-investors. Standing near the back wall, laughing politely at a joke, was a woman in a severely tailored navy suit. I recognized her instantly from a LinkedIn search Adrian had conducted. She was a senior client relations representative from Harrogate Commercial Finance. Evelyn had actually invited the bank to witness her stolen empire. I stood quietly near the entrance, observing the performance. Nolan was in his absolute element, playing the role of the visionary, polite co-founder to absolute perfection. He was leading the two potential investors on a guided tour of the space, gesturing broadly toward the load-bearing walls. He confidently pointed out where the new commercial ovens would be installed and how the front windows would be expanded to allow for better afternoon lighting. He spoke about the structural modifications as if the permits were already framed and hanging on the wall, completely ignoring the fact that he possessed absolutely zero legal authority to drive a single nail into those bricks. Evelyn, meanwhile, was holding court near the central tasting table. She wore a stunning emerald green silk blouse and a delicate pearl necklace, projecting the image of a benevolent, successful matriarch. She was telling a captivating story to the Harrogate representative and a few of her old socialite friends, weaving a beautiful fabricated narrative about how the family was coming together to build a table for the community. I stepped fully into the light, dressed in a sharp tailored black blazer and tailored trousers. My makeup was minimal, my expression completely neutral, and my posture rigidly controlled. The moment my heels clicked against the exposed concrete near the door, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations naturally tapered off, heads turned. Despite Evelyn's desperate attempts to control the narrative, everyone in that room, especially the investors and the bank representative, knew exactly whose name was actually on the deed to the building. They knew the ultimate power of decision resided quietly in my hands. Evelyn spotted me, and for a fleeting, microscopic second, a flash of genuine panic crossed her eyes, but she recovered instantly, misinterpreting my calm arrival as a silent surrender. She assumed I had finally capitulated to the social pressure. She thought I was there to fall in line and play the role of the supportive daughter-in-law, so as not to embarrass myself in front of Belmeadow high society. Emboldened by her own delusion, Evelyn clapped her hands together lightly, drawing the full attention of the room. "Everyone, if I could just have your attention for a brief moment," Evelyn announced, her voice echoing brightly against the high ceilings. She smiled warmly, gesturing gracefully in my direction. "I am so incredibly thrilled that our foundational partner, my beautiful daughter-in-law, Mia, could join us this evening. As many of you know, bringing a complex family vision to life requires immense patience and a shared understanding of the future." She stepped closer to Nolan, placing a proud maternal hand on his shoulder. "I want to publicly thank my wonderful son, Nolan, for his relentless perseverance. He has fought so hard for the future of our family legacy, navigating the complicated administrative waters to make tonight possible. And I want to thank Mia for finally seeing the true potential of what we are building here together. It takes a strong woman to recognize a grander vision." It was a masterstroke of manipulative public speaking. She was publicly praising my husband for bullying me, while simultaneously trapping me in a narrative of compliance. She was politely daring me to cause a scene and ruin the elegant atmosphere. I did not take the bait. I did not frown, and I certainly did not object. I simply offered a polite, close-lipped smile and nodded once, taking my silence as total victory. Evelyn turned back to her audience, her voice rising with uncontainable excitement. I stood perfectly still and let her talk. I let her speak longer. I let her dig the hole deeper and wider. I watched the Harrogate representative nod approvingly as Evelyn detailed the projected revenue streams. I listened as Nolan confidently explained the specific terms of the commercial lease they were supposedly drafting, outlining the exact square footage they claimed to control. I let every single guest in that room hear, straight from their own mouths, the deliberate, calculated misrepresentation of my property and my legal consent. "This tasting is just the very first glimpse of our commitment to culinary excellence," Evelyn declared, raising her crystal glass of champagne high into the air. The candlelight caught the bubbles, making the moment look incredibly cinematic. "The momentum we have built over the last few weeks is simply unstoppable. The financing is aligning perfectly. The community support is overwhelming. And I am incredibly proud to officially announce that within 30 days, this very space will open its doors to the public. Within 30 days, this room will officially bear the name Mercer Table." The guests smiled, raising their glasses in preparation for the toast. The investors nodded in silent approval. The Harrogate representative looked thoroughly impressed by the aggressive, confident timeline. I took 2 slow steps forward, closing the distance between myself and the center of the room. The soft murmur of anticipation quieted down. I looked directly at Evelyn, my expression perfectly serene, and I asked a single, very light question. Who signed off on that 30-day timeline? My voice was not loud, but it cut through the warm, celebratory atmosphere like a jagged piece of ice. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. The glasses hovering in the air completely froze. The wealthy acquaintances exchanged uncertain, uncomfortable glances. The Harrogate representative lowered her champagne, her professional instincts suddenly flaring as she looked from Evelyn to me, sensing the catastrophic legal discrepancy. Evelyn's triumphant smile instantly shattered. Her jaw tightened, and she stared at me with pure, unmasked venom, realizing in a blinding flash that I had not come to surrender. I had come to witness the crime. Nolan, desperate to save the sinking ship and prevent his wealthy guests from fleeing, hurriedly stepped forward. He forced out a loud, unnatural chuckle, waving his hand dismissively as if my question was just a minor, silly administrative oversight between spouses. "Oh, you know how these massive commercial projects are," Nolan interjected smoothly, flashing a frantic, strained smile at the investors. The bureaucratic paperwork is always the very last thing to catch up to the physical reality. The foundational documents are almost completely finalized. It is just a matter of crossing a few minor legal formalities early next week. He thought he was reassuring the room. He thought he was saving face. He had absolutely no idea that by publicly admitting the legal documents were not finalized, right after his mother claimed absolute ownership within a 30-day window, he had just handed my attorney the exact verbal confession she needed. He had just hammered the final, undeniable nail into the coffin of their fraudulent enterprise right in front of the bank's own compliance officer. I did not argue with him. I did not correct his blatant lie in front of the guests. I simply walked over to the nearest catering table and picked up a tall glass of sparkling water. Ignoring the expensive champagne entirely, I turned back to face my husband and my mother-in-law. I looked at their pale, terrified faces, beautifully illuminated by the expensive candles they had bought with the intention of using my credit card. I offered them a genuine, brilliant smile that did not reach my eyes. "Good," I said, my voice ringing out with terrifying, absolute clarity in the dead silent room. "Then Monday morning will be very simple." Monday morning arrived with a sharp, unforgiving clarity. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, perfectly matching the cold, unyielding resolve that had settled permanently in my chest. Nolan and Evelyn had left the apartment early, dressed in their absolute best business attire. They stepped out the door radiating a tense but undeniable sense of hopeful victory. They honestly believed that because I had not thrown a screaming tantrum in front of their wealthy Bell Meadow guests on Friday night, I had effectively surrendered. They thought my calm departure meant I was finally falling in line to play my assigned role as the silent, obedient financial backer for their grand enterprise. They arrived at the sleek glass-walled downtown corporate offices of Harrogate Commercial Finance at exactly 9 in the morning. They were seated in the primary executive conference room, sipping complimentary sparkling water, confidently waiting to finalize the preliminary paperwork for their massive startup loan. I walked through those heavy glass doors exactly 7 minutes later. I did not walk in alone. Flanking my right side was Adrian Vale, carrying a thick, perfectly organized leather briefcase that looked significantly more intimidating than the one I had found in my home office. On my left was a senior internal compliance investigator from Harrogate, a man we had thoroughly briefed over a secure conference call the previous week. When the three of us stepped into the boardroom, the confident, relaxed atmosphere instantly evaporated. Nolan's polite, professional smile froze on his face. Evelyn lowered her glass of water, her eyes darting nervously between my tailored suit and the severe, unsmiling expressions of the two professionals standing beside me. The assigned loan officer, a young man eager to close a large account, stood up to greet us, completely confused by the sudden change in attendance. Adrienne did not wait for introductions. She bypassed the pleasantries entirely, stepped up to the massive mahogany table, and immediately took absolute control of the room. "Good morning," Adrian stated, her voice slicing through the heavy silence like a steel blade. "We are here to formally clarify the legal ownership structure and the authorized approval records regarding the commercial property located at Wainwright Row, which is currently listed as the primary collateral on this pending application." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of certified, notarized documents, sliding them precisely across the polished wood toward the loan officer. "As you will clearly see in these state-certified filings, my client, Mia Wainwright, is the sole managing member of the limited liability company that holds the deed to that property," Adrian continued, staring directly at Nolan. "Nolan Mercer possesses absolutely zero legal status to manage, leverage, or encumber that asset. Furthermore, Evelyn Mercer possesses absolutely no legal right to occupy, lease, or utilize the ground floor commercial space. Every single presentation, projection, and assurance you have been given regarding Wainwright Row over the past several months has been based on an intentional, legally actionable misrepresentation of ownership." The loan officer blanched, his hands hovering over the documents as if they were suddenly on fire. Before Evelyn could open her mouth to launch into her practiced victim routine, the senior compliance investigator stepped forward. He reached into his own folder and placed a single piece of paper squarely in the center of the table. It was a printed copy of the spouse consent form. Our internal fraud division ran a standard metadata sweep on this document, which was uploaded from a private IP address late last week, the investigator said, his tone clinically cold. "The signature on this page is a digital insertion. It was lifted from an external source and pasted onto our proprietary legal form. Uploading a forged signature to a federally regulated financial institution to secure commercial funding is not a placeholder, Mr. Mercer. It is a severe federal offense." I watched the remaining color violently drain from my husband's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and finally realized gravity was real. His jaw trembled. He looked at the printed form, then at the investigator, and finally at me, realizing with absolute, horrifying clarity that his clever little trick to push the paperwork through had just become a permanent, documented record of fraud. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but his vocal cords completely failed him. I stepped forward and placed my own document on the table. It was a formal, legally binding notice of immediate revocation. "This is an official notice terminating any and all implied rights to use the ground floor space of my building," I said, looking directly into Evelyn's eyes. "Any vendor agreements you have signed, any catering deposits you have collected, and any promises you have made to those wealthy friends you paraded through my property are null and void. They are entirely your personal responsibility. Neither I nor Wainwright Row will be held liable for a single penny of the debt you accumulated trying to sell a dream on a stage you never owned." Adrian delivered the final, crushing blow. She pulled out the certified report from the independent building inspector and dropped it right next to the forged signature. "Additionally," Adrian announced, "we have officially documented that the vacant space in question does not possess the mandatory health department clearances, ventilation permits, or active zoning approvals required for commercial food preparation or public consumption. The tasting event hosted there last Friday was a blatant violation of city ordinances. This document transforms your lavish social gathering from a simple marketing stunt into concrete evidence that you were actively conducting unpermitted business operations on stolen property." The boardroom was dead silent. The loan officer immediately gathered his files, quietly stating that the application was permanently halted and that all internal Harrow Gate accounts associated with Mercer Table were frozen pending a full legal review. I knew for a fact that the two small private investors from Bell Meadow had already backed out. I had personally sent them a very brief, incredibly polite, and legally undeniable email detailing the true ownership of the building at 7 o'clock that morning. Evelyn finally broke. She stood up, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her perfect composure shattering into a million desperate pieces. "This is just a massive misunderstanding," she stammered loudly, looking frantically at the loan officer and the investigator. Mia is just upset. We are a family. We can work this out internally. There is no need for all of this hostility. Just as the words left her mouth, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. A man in a plain gray suit walked in, completely ignoring the tension in the room. He was a licensed process server Adrian had meticulously scheduled to arrive at this exact moment. "Nolan Mercer?" the man asked, holding a thick manila envelope. Nolan nodded numbly, too paralyzed by shock to deny his own name. The server pressed the envelope firmly against Nolan's chest. "You have been served." Nolan looked down at the envelope. Inside were the official divorce filings, an absolute demand to vacate the shared apartment within the minimum legal time frame, and a formal restraining order legally barring him from accessing the keypad locks, the financial records, and the entire ground floor of Wainwright Row. I did not wait to watch him cry. I did not wait to hear Evelyn scream. I turned around, walked out of the glass boardroom, and stepped into the bright morning sunlight, leaving them entirely alone in the wreckage of their own making. That evening, the air in my apartment felt lighter than it had in years. The suffocating tension was gone. Nolan had hastily packed 2 suitcases and left before sunset. I walked downstairs to the ground floor, pulled up the administrative panel on the electronic keypad, and permanently deleted his access code. I typed in a brand new sequence, hearing the satisfying, heavy click of the deadbolt securing my property. I walked back inside the vacant space. The rented tables and the fake luxury were completely gone. Sitting at a small folding table in the center of the room were 2 brilliant, hard-working local women. We spent the next hour reviewing a fair, mutually beneficial commercial lease agreement. They were going to transform the space into a cozy, independent bookstore and coffee counter. They had their own funding, their own business licenses, and a deep respect for the community. I signed the bottom of the last page with my own pen, using my real signature, and handed them the keys. When I finally walked back upstairs to my apartment, I was carrying a small brown paper bag from the local corner market. I unpacked it slowly on the granite kitchen island. I had bought a fresh loaf of whole wheat bread, a carton of eggs, and some simple roasted turkey. There was no imported caviar in the fridge. There was no gold-wrapped chocolate hidden in the pantry. There were no more delusions of unearned grandeur. And there were no more parasites feeding on my foundation. I stood in the quiet kitchen, listening to the peaceful silence, knowing that for the very first time in years, every single thing under this roof belonged entirely to the person who actually built it. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me by hitting the hype button so this story can reach even more people.